There are places where at night, the earth seems to whisper things people try to forget. In a damp part of Tennessee, it was said that if you walked past the ruins of an old farmhouse called Cypress Grove, you would hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the rocks like someone praying in despair. It was once a place of lavish parties of power and of a secret society called the Brethren, people who considered themselves the ones who decided who would live and who would die. But then, one summer night, the darkness in Cypress Grove was no longer docile. It rose along with those who had suffered too long. Tonight's story is about Catherine Rutledge, the daughter of sin, and the spark of revenge after 16 years of being broken. About Ezekiel, the slave who became justice in human form. And the night when power collapsed in fire. Have you ever wondered, does justice really exist? Or only when people have nothing left to lose? April 1841. A month that began like any other in Colleton County, South Carolina, until Silas Rutledge made an announcement that silenced even the cruelest among the plantation class. He declared that his only daughter Catherine, a woman of 28 years and over 260 pounds, would be placed under the complete authority of an enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross, not as a nurse, not as a companion, but as her master in every way that mattered, though never written on paper. The white gentry of Colleton County whispered, scandalized. But none of them understood what Silas was truly doing, or what Ezekiel Cross would soon do to his daughter. By November, Catherine's body had changed in ways no physician could explain. 13 men were dead, and Cypress Grove Plantation was nothing but ash. What really happened between that enslaved man and the planter's daughter? What kind of power passed between them that made even the most hardened men look away in terror? Before we begin to unearth the truth, if truth is even the right word, for what you're about to hear, take a slow breath. And maybe ask yourself, what would drive a father to surrender his child to the very system he commanded? Now, let me take you back to where it began. Spring in Colleton County came heavy, humid, and close, as though the air itself were trying to drown you. The Combe River moved sluggishly through the low country, its dark surface rippling beneath veils of Spanish moss that hung from the oaks like tattered funeral shrouds. Rice fields stretched for miles. Green mirrors flooded knee-deep, where hundreds of enslaved people bent their backs from dawn until dusk. This was a landscape of wealth built on suffering prosperity, extracted from human misery, all justified by men who called their cruelty the natural order of things. Cypress Grove Plantation sat on 800 acres of modestly fertile land. Its owner, Silas Rutledge, wasn't among the county's elite, but he longed to be. He owned 58 enslaved people, enough to make him wealthy by most standards, but far from powerful. The true masters of Colleton County were the families with thousands of acres and hundreds of souls bound to their will. They summered in Charleston, sent their sons to northern universities, and carried names that could open doors or destroy reputations with a single whisper. Silas had married Elizabeth Yancey in 1812, a union that brought him respect and a bit of land. Elizabeth was practical, meticulous, more interested in ledgers than parties. She died a year later, giving birth to a daughter they named Catherine. For 28 years, Silas raised her alone, pouring his energy into the desperate pursuit of status. He was tall, gaunt, with prematurely grey hair and a face carved by ambition. Known for being shrewd yet principled, he was the kind of man who would drive a bargain hard but never break his word. Catherine grew up in isolation, educated by tutors, surrounded by silence. By 1841, she was 28 and weighed nearly 260 pounds. Her body was swollen from years of medication prescribed by doctors who said she suffered from hysteria from female nervous disorders. She had violent fits, screaming, throwing whatever her hands could find. Once, she'd attacked her father with a letter opener, leaving a scar across his left hand. The society women of Colleton County gossiped behind closed doors, their voices dripping with false sympathy. Poor Silas Rutledge, burdened with a mad daughter. What a pity. She had been such a lovely child, but none of them knew the truth. None of them knew what Catherine had seen at 12 years old, or that her madness was not madness at all, but a reaction to the monsters she had grown up among. Then, on April 7th, a letter arrived, delivered by private courier, sealed with red wax. Silas opened it in his study, expecting business. But inside were 3 pages written on fine paper, stamped with a symbol he recognized immediately, a scythe crossed with stalks of wheat, the mark of the brethren of the harvest. 13 men who met in darkness, believing that the land could be made fertile through ritual blood. They called it strengthening the soil. Others might have called it something else entirely. Their practices drew from old European rites and from spiritual traditions stolen from those they enslaved people who understood power in ways these men could never fathom. The brethren of the harvest had a simple creed that the strong were meant to consume the weak literally if necessary. Silas Rutledge had joined them in 1822. 19 years had passed since that first initiation, and he had attended perhaps 40 gatherings, each one darker than the last. What began as symbolic rituals of soil and blood had turned into something monstrous ceremonies, whispered about even among those who called themselves civilized men. The letter before him that April night was not a greeting. It was a demand. It reminded him of debts he could no longer deny, $12,000 borrowed over years of gambling and failed investments. A sum so vast, it would ruin him. Repayment meant selling his land, his people, his pride, everything he had clawed together in pursuit of belonging. But at the bottom of the letter was an alternative. A demonstration of renewed faith for members in difficult positions. Silas would place his daughter Catherine under the full and public authority of one of his enslaved men, not as punishment, not as experiment, but as a complete transfer of control for 1 full year. The man would decide everything about her life, what she ate, where she slept, how she was treated. Silas was to announce this publicly, before the county's finest families, explaining it away as a desperate medical treatment for his daughter's condition. The humiliation would be absolute. In a world where white womanhood was guarded as sacred, he would be declaring that his daughter was worth less than the ground his slaves walked on. Yet, if he agreed, the brethren would forgive his debt. They would restore his standing, his comfort, his place at their table. That night, Silas sat alone in his study. The candle burned low. The room seemed to tilt in the dark. He thought about bankruptcy, the disgrace, the ruin. He thought about the brethren, the judges, the lawyers, the men who could make him vanish with a single word. And then he thought about Catherine and how the world had taught him what must come first: property before people, power before mercy. He dipped his quill in ink and by the pale light of the candle wrote a single word of acceptance. Before dawn, he sent it away. 3 days later, another letter arrived. This one bore a name: Ezekiel Cross, age 33, purchased through an intermediary in Virginia, skilled in carpentry and herbal medicine. Temperament, quiet, obedient. But the letter did not say what mattered most: that Ezekiel Cross had been chosen for a reason, that his presence at Cypress Grove was no accident, that somewhere behind his silence, he carried a need for justice patient and burning. He arrived on April 13th. The morning was sharp and bright sunlight spilling over the rice fields like gold over a grave. The wagon that carried him rolled straight up to the main house, an unusual act, since slave deliveries were usually done in the shadows near the barns. Silas stepped onto the porch, hand raised to block the glare. In the wagon bed sat Ezekiel. The first thing Silas noticed was the eyes. Most enslaved people looked down a habit learned for survival. But Ezekiel didn't. He looked directly at Silas, calm, unflinching, as though measuring him in silence. It made Silas uneasy. Ezekiel was tall, perhaps 6 feet 2, with broad shoulders and a body carved by labor. His skin was dark and unscarred, his clothes simple but clean. His hands were calloused, yet his fingers moved with a precision that spoke of skill, not brute strength. The trader Henderson climbed down from the wagon, handing over the papers. Ezekiel Cross as requested, quiet, capable. Your associates wanted me to say? This one was carefully selected. Silas barely glanced at the documents. His gaze never left the man before him. You understand why you are here? He asked. Ezekiel's reply came low and steady, marked by the faintest trace of a Virginia accent. Yes, sir. My daughter is unwell. You will be responsible for her care. The doctors have failed. I'm told you know something of herbal treatment. My grandmother was a healer, Sir Ezekiel said. She taught me before I was sold. The transaction ended as quickly as it began. Ezekiel was shown to a small cabin near the main house, not with the others, but alone where Silas could watch him closely. He was given a cot, a lantern, and enough food for one. His only duty, he was told, was the care of Miss Catherine. Failure would bring severe punishment. Ezekiel nodded once, his voice calm. Yes, sir. But deep in the quiet of that morning, as the wagon rolled away and the house doors closed, something unspoken passed between them, a shift in the air, subtle as a breath. A beginning. Neither of them would survive unchanged. Then he was alone. For the first time since arriving, Ezekiel let something of his guard fall away. A small unclenching of the jaw, a tiny relaxation of the shoulders. He sat on the narrow cot and from beneath his shirt took out a little cloth bundle. Fingers careful as if handling something sacred, he unfolded it. Inside was a worn scrap of paper, the scrawl of a child pressed into the fibers. 3 names: Sarah Benjamin Ruth, his wife, his son, his little girl. Sold away 3 years before to a plantation in Alabama, a place whispered about for working people until they died. He had learned in scraps of rumor and rumor's cruel confirmations that they were gone within 18 months. Sarah fell by fever, left without care Benjamin, from an injury that turned septic, and Ruth, who simply stopped eating because a 6-year-old could not make sense of such cruelty. And the man who had signed the papers that tore them apart was Silas Rutledge. Not for necessity, not for debt, no, because he needed to prove for the brethren that he could be without sentiment. He had cleaved a family like kindling and watched it burn. Ezekiel had not arrived here by chance. He had spent 2 years steering his life southward, arranging to be sold from place to place until the path led him to Rutledge's land. He listened to whispers, by night learned the names of men who met in darkness, the outlines of rituals that treated flesh as a thing to be spent. He learned that these men believed themselves outside consequence, and when the opportunity came to be sent to Cypress Grove, he took it. It was patience, not fury, that had brought him this far. Patience and a plan. Sometimes justice waits for the right frame, the right place, and a readiness to become monstrous in the exact ways the world had already taught them. He folded the paper, slid it back into the cloth, and lay staring at the ceiling boards until the shadows lengthened and the house sighed with the coming night. Then he began to plan. His work began the next morning, April 14th. The house slave, Judith, middle-aged, with hair threaded through with grey, escorted him up the stairs, knocking at Catherine's door with a hesitance that smelled of sympathy and fear. "Miss Catherine?" she murmured. "Your father has brought someone to help with your treatments." From inside came a crash, something heavy, thrown against plaster, and then Catherine's voice, ragged and poisonous. "I do not want more treatments. Send him away." Judith's eyes met Ezekiel's. "She has bad days," the look said. "This is one of them." She lingered pity heavy, then retreated when Ezekiel opened the door and gently shut it behind him. The room breathed cold and dark. Heavy curtains hid the world outside. The air smelled of unwashed linens and something metallic mercury, the sickly sweet ghost of the medicines they fed her. Books lay scattered. A picture frame lay smashed on the floor. Clothing was tossed like discarded thought. By the hearth, Catherine sat in a threadbare dressing gown, hair loose and tangled, her face swollen and unreadable. Her hands never stopped trembling. When Ezekiel stepped forward, she watched him flicker through confusion, fear, then finally anger. "Who are you?" she spat. "I told them no more doctors." Ezekiel kept his voice soft even. "I am not a doctor, miss. My name is Ezekiel. Your father sent me to help." She laughed, if the sound could be called laughter, harsh and brittle. That is what they always say. Help. Treatment. Poison. Chains. Silence. She swayed as she stood. "He punishes me for remembering, for speaking, for refusing to forget." Ezekiel did not move closer in menace. He did not raise his voice. He asked simply, "What are you supposed to forget?" The question stopped her like a hand on her shoulder. The fury thinned, and something raw and smaller returned to her face. "You do not know," she said, wounded. "You know nothing." "I know nothing, miss," he answered. "Only that your father says you are unwell." She studied him then, as if seeing him afresh. "You are not from here," she observed. "Virginia originally, miss," he replied. Her eyes sharpened. Do you know what happens in this house? Down in the cellar, Ezekiel's heart clicked quicker, but his face remained a calm river. I do not know what you mean, he said. She called out the word liar, like a thrown stone, and then, with the dimness of long weariness, said only no heat in it, just exhaustion. Everyone lies. It is easier than truth. She sank back into her chair. Leave me be. Tell my father his newest torment failed. Instead, Ezekiel moved to the window and drew the curtains aside. For a second, sunlight rushed in and Catherine shielded her eyes, crying out at the brightness. When did you last go outside? He asked softly. I cannot walk that far, she breathed. I am too weak. When did you last eat without Luden? A minute, he pressed. The doctors say it is necessary. Her hands went to her face. They say the medicine helps. Then, with the quiet that bends a moment, Ezekiel laid down the first card of his plan. What if the doctors are wrong? He asked. What if everything you have been told about your condition is not meant to cure you, but to keep you controllable? What if your father has been giving you something for years, so you will never be well enough to speak about what you witnessed? Catherine's hands stilled. Her eyes widened as though a window had been opened inside her. 30 seconds passed when neither of them spoke. The house seemed to lean in. When she did speak, her voice was clear, stripped of the rasp that the medicines had carved into it. He told you nothing, she said, but you have eyes. I know mercury poisoning. I know long-term Luden use. Healthy women do not become like this without someone pushing them to be this way. Suspicion edged back into her tone. Why would you say this? She demanded. This is a trick. You are testing me. Ezekiel met her steady. I am telling you, I can help you get well. But it will not be easy. Your body has grown dependent. Stopping will hurt. You will feel worse before better, and your father will not approve. Then why would you do it? Her question trembled, part caution, part a hope she could not yet name. Because I have my reasons for wanting Silas Rutledge to suffer, Ezekiel said quietly. And the best way to make him suffer is to give him back a daughter who remembers, who can speak everything she has seen. He did not say more. The truth of his words was dangerous to pronounce plainly, but it was a truth that might reach her, that he had lost a family, to Silas's hands, that he had bent his life into a long tool for this very moment. Catherine listened. Hurt and clarity crossed her face in the same breath. She was broken, scarred, and bruised by the medicines and the silences, but not simple. She would not be fooled forever. And yet, the thought of a common cause, real, plausible, something that might be trusted, moved behind her eyes. You want revenge on my father? She asked at last. Yes, Miss Ezekiel answered. What did he do to you? She pressed. He told her then, in words measured and small, how Silas had sold his wife and 2 children, sending them to a place where they died because cruelty was currency for the brethren. Catherine took it in slowly, the pieces sliding into place. She nodded once, twice, like someone agreeing to the first page of a plan whose ending she did not yet know. The brethren, Ezekiel said quietly. He sold them for the brethren, not a question. The brethren miss you, do not know. Catherine laughed, then a raw manic sound that skated along the edges of something dangerous. You will learn, she said, eyes bright with a terrible promise. Everyone learns eventually. She leaned forward, the motion sudden and fierce. If I agree, if I let you help me, what happens? Then she asked. You get well, miss, Ezekiel answered simply. And when you are well, we decide what to do next. I have my revenge to plan. You will have yours. Perhaps they will align. Catherine studied him as though gauging the weight of a blade. At last, she spoke the words cold and precise. I want them all dead. My father, Judge Pelham, Reverend Crenshaw, every man who stood in that cellar. I want them to suffer, first make them beg, then I want them dead. The venom of that sentence shocked Ezekiel, not because it was extreme, but because it came from someone everyone had written off as harmless and mad. This was not madness. It was rage concentrated and sharpened by years of being silenced. Ezekiel nodded steady. Then we have an understanding, Miss Catherine. If we are conspirators, she said, use my name. He shook his head. I cannot, miss. Not where anyone might hear. We must be careful. She smiled then, and it was not a gentle thing. Know this, Ezekiel. Her eyes glittered with a dangerous light. I have killed before. She spoke the words without embarrassment. 3 people, house slaves, who might have told my father about my lucid moments. I cannot remember the details. The Loden blurs it, but I know I did it. They disappeared. Their families were told, they ran away. Her smile cut harder. So if you plan to betray me, if you plan to use me and discard me, know that I am not a victim. I am something worse. Ice slid down Ezekiel's spine. He had expected an ally, not someone whose capacity for violence might outstrip his own. Still, he kept his face composed. I believe you, miss, and I will not betray you. Good. Catherine straightened, steadier than she had been in months. Then, let us begin. She paused. But I have one condition. When this is over, when we have had our revenge, I want to die. I do not want to carry what I have seen and done. Ezekiel did not expect to be asked to grant such a thing, but the bargain was sealed in the small, terrible way that bargains are sealed in rooms smelling of dust and sickness. Agreed, he said. Catherine extended her hand. After a breath, Ezekiel took it. Her grip was stronger than he had thought, a small shock of muscle and will. The week that followed was medicine and calculation. Ezekiel began her treatment, slowly reducing the Loden and other tinctures she had been given, replacing some doses with poultices and herbal tinctures his grandmother had shown him in Virginia valerian root to ease trembling and invite honest sleep chamomile for the stomach hollowed by years of poisons. Milk thistle to coax a liver ravaged by mercury back toward function. The withdrawal was brutal. Catherine spent 3 days fevered and convulsing, retching in a basin, while Ezekiel remained at her side, a quiet presence wiping sweat from her brow, murmuring little reminders that she was not alone. He held the basin. He cooled her skin. He listened to the night winds and kept the shutters closed against prying ears. When the worst of it passed, she was left hollow and raw but clearer. The tremor that had been a constant shiver in her hands eased. Her speech lost some of its heavy slur. She could focus on a page of text without the letters swimming away. And then the real labor began. First, he made her walk. From her chamber to the hallway, then a step further each day. Small distances that exhausted her, but he pressed on, gentle and unyielding. He changed her food: lean meats, fresh greens instead of pastries and heavy sweets. He limited portions which she resisted. Food had been a refuge in years of enforced weakness. He reframed comfort as strength. While the body mended, the mind opened. She told him about the cellar, the things she had seen at 12 years old, the visitors who came in the night, the sounds from beneath the house that did not belong to the living. She described the gaslighting that followed, how her father convinced neighbors, tutors, even herself, that her memories were fantasies born of illness. She spoke of hidden journal pages tucked away with dates and names, records of footsteps, late departures, and noises that should not exist under the floorboards. Ezekiel answered in kind. He told her about Sarah, who had hummed while she worked, and taught their children small mercies like reading from scraps. Benjamin, who at 8 could do sums that surprised the overseers. Ruth, who gathered wildflowers to make their cabin bloom. He told her how Silas had come to the Virginia plantation like a man shopping for furniture, inspecting, selecting, deciding. How he had purchased them not out of need, but to prove something to his peers. How at the last moment he had coldly split the family, taking the mother and children while leaving Ezekiel behind, not because of profit, but because cruelty itself was a currency. He told her of his son's cry as he clutched Ezekiel's leg, of his wife's brave face cracking, and of Silas's smile, an expression that Ezekiel said quietly seemed to give him pleasure to inflict pain. Catherine listened with a clarity that frightened and steadied her at once. "I am sorry," she said at last. "I know sorry is only a word, but I am sorry you suffered because of what my father is." She placed the guilt and the smallness of the apology in the air and then set it down. "You are not responsible for what he does, miss." "No," she answered, "but I am responsible for what I do next. And I promise you, Ezekiel, he will pay for what he took from you. They will all pay." The formal announcement drew near. April 29th, marked on invitations in gilt script. 41 people would gather in the Cypress Grove dining room for what the cards called an important family declaration. Carriages rolled up the drive. The county's finest attended Judge Pelham and his wife Eleanor, Reverend Crenshaw with his daughter, Marcus Fanning and his kin, Benjamin Lyle from the bank. Each came with a carriage's worth of gossip and the kind of confidence that comes from being untouchable. The dinner that night was a study in abundance and pretense. Oysters, roasted duck, several rice dishes, sweet potatoes, fresh, warm bread. Each course presented with the care of hosts who believed display could disguise guilt. A towering cake waited for dessert, like a monument everyone pretended not to notice. Catherine sat at her father's right hand, eating little, speaking only when obliged, offering no more than what decorum demanded. Ezekiel moved among the servants, refilling glasses and clearing plates beside other house slaves, present but intentionally unseen. He listened. He watched. He gathered every laugh that hid a knife, every furtive glance, every phrase that would fit into the ledger he and Catherine were building in their heads. After dessert, Silas rose and tapped his glass. "My friends," he began, voice polished with practiced ease, "thank you for joining us. As you know, Catherine has been unwell these last years. We tried doctors from Charleston, a specialist from Philadelphia. Nothing helped until recently." He nodded toward Ezekiel. 2 weeks ago, I brought in Ezekiel, who has knowledge of herbal medicine. As you can see, Catherine is much improved, clearer, calmer. More herself than she's been in many years. Soft murmurs of approval rippled around the table. Catherine held her face like a mask. Ezekiel watched her fingers curl white around her napkin beneath the linen. Silas continued the rehearsed finality of his words cutting the room. This improvement has led to a difficult decision. Catherine requires ongoing care more intensive than our household can provide. After much thought, I have decided that Ezekiel will assume full responsibility for my daughter's welfare. He will have complete authority over her treatment, daily activities, and living arrangements effective immediately. The murmur shifted shape into confusion. Eyes widened. Mrs. Pelham's mouth fell open. Marcus Fanning sputtered, "Silas, I do not understand. You are placing your daughter permanently under a slave's care." Silas's reply came like a blade wrapped in velvet. "I place her with someone who succeeded where others failed. My daughter's health is more important than social convention." But surely Reverend Crenshaw began, voice oily with the edge of a man who measures his words for profit. "There are other options. A companion, a nurse, someone more appropriate." Silas's face went hard. "I have made my decision." Catherine agrees. "Do you not, daughter?" All eyes swung to Catherine. This was the precipice where she could refuse, shout the truth into the room, shatter the charade. Instead, she smiled small, steady, perfectly composed. "I trust my father's judgment. Ezekiel has been kind and his treatments help. I'm content with this arrangement." The performance was flawless. But Ezekiel saw what others did not. The whiteness at her knuckles, the flash behind her eyes. She played the obedient part as neatly as any actor, while inside she burned. The rest of the evening stumbled along with strained talk. Some guests left early, others lingered in whispered corners to consult Silas in low tones. Questions they did not want recorded openly. Ezekiel overheard fragments as he moved about. "Are you certain this is wise? What will people say? The brethren will not approve of this becoming public," murmured Judge Pelham near the study. Silas's reply was too soft to catch. But whatever it was, settled the judge enough that Pelham nodded and clapped Silas on the shoulder like a conspirator. By midnight, the last carriage rolled away. Catherine went to her rooms. Silas to his study. Ezekiel stayed to clear the final plates, then climbed the stairs to her door and knocked once gently. "Come in," she called. She sat by the window, wrapped in her dinner dress, staring out into the dark where the grounds swallowed moonlight. She did not turn when he entered. "So it is done," she said. "I am officially your responsibility, property of property." "How absurd. How are you feeling?" Miss Ezekiel asked, voice low. "I want to burn this house down with everyone in it," she replied without surprise. "But we must be patient." "Isn't that what you keep telling me?" "Yes, miss." He had agreed to patience because patience was the frame of his plan. I agreed so they would feel safe. So they would think, this is merely my father's eccentricity. We must be invisible while we work. She turned then, and for the first time that night, looked at him with something close to a smile. Did you see their faces? The disgust, the pity. They think I am pathetic. They have no idea what we are planning. And what exactly are we planning? "Miss?" he asked. She crossed to her dresser and opened a small wooden box, fingers reverent. Inside lay folded papers, pages inked in her hand dates, and notes crowded like teeth. I have been documenting everything she said. Dates, times, names, ritual descriptions coded so that if anyone finds them, they look like nonsense. But I can read it. "We have enough to destroy 20 men. Ezekiel's heart thudded, then cooled with a skeptic's caution. "Will anyone believe us?" he asked. She nodded hard. "No. A woman who has been written mad and an enslaved man, our words would be dismissed. Which is why we need proof. Real physical proof they cannot flinch away from." She thumbed through the papers and drew out one page in particular, pointing at a sentence written tight and sure. "They keep a ledger. The brethren maintain a ledger of every ritual, every sacrifice, every man who took part. It is their insurance proof that binds them together in guilt. My father mentioned it once before. He knew I would remember. It is kept in the cellar behind a hidden room adjacent to the main chamber. I never saw inside, but I heard them speak of it. Ezekiel felt a surge of cold and heat at once. Such a ledger would be ruin the kind of evidence that could not be waved away with a laugh. But to take it, they would have to enter the very heart of the brethren's domain, where secrets sat heavy as stones. "When would we take it?" he asked. "When the house is quiet," she said. "When the father is away. He travels to Charleston monthly on business." They sat together in the hush of the room, plans beginning to make themselves like seeds cracking in dark soil. Outside, the plantation breathed around them, fields and river, and the slow turning of a place built on other people's silence. Inside, two conspirators plotted to pull that silence apart. The next trip is May 14th. Silas would be gone 3 days. That left them 2 weeks to prepare, 2 weeks to learn the house as if it were a body, to be read every room, every panel, every hiding place. "I can help," Catherine said. "I have been thinking about this for 16 years. I know exactly what must happen." They spent an hour speaking in whispers, voices small as moth wings. Catherine sketched the cellar from memory angles alcoves, the one stone that did not sit quite flush with the rest. Ezekiel asked about keys, guards, slave schedules, the shift patterns of men who left the property at dusk. When he left her room, it was nearly 2 in the morning. His head buzzed with plans and the weight of what he had promised. He was now fully committed to a conspiracy with a woman who was brilliant and broken and dangerous. By candlelight, he unfolded the paper with his family's names and let the ink blur into the wavering flame. "I am doing this for you," he told the empty room, for Sarah Benjamin Ruth, for every soul ruined because men like Silas Rutledge believe power gives them license to destroy lives. He snuffed the candle and lay in the dark, listening to the house settle around him. Timbers contracting floors, sighing the low, distant breaths of rooms that held secrets. Somewhere beneath him were truths that could rend the county's finest families. In 2 weeks, he would go down there to find them. The fortnight that followed carried the hush of deception. Catherine improved in small, steady ways. Her weight fell, her voice sharpened. She walked further each day. Most important of all, she translated pages of her coded journal for Ezekiel, feeding him details about the brethren that left a metallic taste in his mouth. The brethren of Colatin were not an isolated orgy of cruelty. They were a strand in a wider net across the South Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, Richmond. Different names in different cities, same monstrous architecture of power. Wealthy men convinced their authority was sanctified by ancient rites, right back to rituals they imagined were older than law. One afternoon, Catherine said they mixed old European mystery cult rites with things they stole from those they enslaved. They twisted everything into a doctrine of dominance. They justified horrors by calling them tradition. She spoke of sacrifices that were sometimes animal, sometimes human. People no one would miss, stray poor whites, slaves with no kin. Once she remembered her father mentioning a child, but the memory fogged at the edges, like a bad dream. "And where do bodies go?" Ezekiel asked. "Swamps," she said simply. Every plantation had one. Bodies go in and disappear. Alligators finish what men begin. She tapped a page. This ledger records everything 40 years of rights, names, dates. It binds them. If you have that ledger, you have proof. They cannot laugh it off when paper calls their names. May 14th arrived with the dry brightness of a day that carried consequences. Silas left at dawn. Carriage rolling toward Charleston, a man comfortable with assuming he controlled absence as well as presence. He would be gone until the evening of May 16th, almost 3 days of near emptiness. They waited until night swallowed the house. By 10 o'clock, the manor had folded into its usual quiet. They met in Catherine's room. She had dressed in dark, practical clothes and tied her hair back tightly. She looked like someone ready for a siege. "Are you certain?" Miss Ezekiel asked. "Nevermore," she said. "Let us go." The kitchen hid the entrance to the cellar behind a pantry door. At first glance, it was only paneling, but pressed in the right spot, it gave with a click K and revealed a narrow flight of stairs leading down into the throat of the house. The air that rose was older than the room above, damp, smoky, and carrying a hollow, organic rot that made Ezekiel's mouth water with bile. "You get used to it," Catherine told him as they eased down. "I wish I could say you stop smelling it, but I'd be lying." They descended with measured care. Ezekiel held a shuttered lantern. Its light was small enough to keep their feet honest, but not so much as to call attention. The stairs were worn smooth by generations of feet and complained beneath them. After about 20 steps, the world opened into a cellar larger than Ezekiel expected, easily 30 feet square, with a low compressed ceiling held up by thick beams. The floor was packed earth. Stones wept moisture along the walls. At the center sat what Catherine had always called the altar, a heavy wooden table, stained in ways that had nothing to do with wine. Grooves carved into its edges, dark marks that spoke of years of work and worse. Along the walls were candle holders, clay jars, sealed with wax wooden boxes banded in iron. A rack hung black robes trimmed with crimson. Shelves crammed with books and ledgers lined one side. The awe felt like a throat closing behind them. Catherine moved with the certainty of someone following a map lodged in bone. She guided him to a section of wall where the stones looked solid, but when pressed at the right pivot, revealed a hidden seam. With a soft click, a panel swung inward and another room breathed out. This inner chamber was smaller, 10 feet by 10, but here lay the brethren's heart shelves of bound volumes, jars wrapped in cloth bundles of papers tied with ribbon. Ezekiel's lantern trembled in his hand. They had found the place where secrets were kept. The ledger sat like a small, terrible altar on its own stand, 2 feet tall, 18 inches wide, leather darkened by decades and bound with iron clasps that had been polished by hands that wanted certain things to remain shut. Beside it lay smaller journals, neat stacks of folded notes, and along the walls rows of jars whose contents Ezekiel dared not study too closely. The air in the inner chamber tasted of old paper and darker things. That is what we need. Catherine breathed, pointing with a hand that did not tremble. Ezekiel approached the book as one approaches a sleeping animal, careful, respectful, and wary. He eased the clasps and opened it. Thick parchment, dense ink names and dates densely written, back to 1800. Ritual descriptions read like dry experiment notes. Times ingredients, seating arrangements, measurements of blood as if measured for a recipe. The more he read, the colder his stomach grew. This was not occasional brutality. This was a system, methodical, scheduled, believed to feed the very earth. They had recorded gatherings almost every 6 weeks, rites married to planting seasons, and moon cycles, sacrifices catalogued like harvests. At least 37 people were noted as lost or consumed across the years: slaves, poor travelers, indigenous people. Worse still, some entries spoke clinically of preparation portions cut in certain ways, parts preserved or salted to be eaten in ritual meals, meant to pass power between men. "Dear God," Ezekiel whispered, voice small in the chamber. "This is worse than I imagined. I watched them when I was 12, Catherine said flatly. I saw them cut pieces from that woman on the altar. I saw my father lift a goblet and drink." She did not flinch while she spoke. Her voice carried the same brittle evenness that had made men think her simple. "For 16 years they told me I was mad. But I knew. I always knew." Ezekiel flipped through pages until his hands found the lines that bore his family's destruction. October 1838, 3 curt entries: purchased family unit from Virginia. Woman Sarah. Children Benjamin, Ruth. Separated from male to demonstrate resolve. Sent to Alabama contact. Payment received. 3 lines. That was all the ledger offered for a family torn apart. "We need to take this." Ezekiel said the words tight with an anger that tasted of iron. Catherine's hand caught his arm, firm, restraining. "If we take it now, they'll know at once," she said. "We must copy the critical parts first." He wanted to set the book aflame to erase the proof in a blaze that would at least feel like victory. But she was right. Revenge demanded cunning more than speed. So they worked with steadiness that rivaled the ledger's meticulousness. Catherine had brought writing paper and ink. For 3 hours by the thin lantern light, they copied entries, names, dates, rituals, and the current men who stood recorded as participants. Ezekiel made lists of victims to be cross-checked against births, deaths, and missing persons in neighboring counties. The work was methodical and exhaustingly cruel. The ink was only one kind of stain on their hands. Several times Ezekiel had to stop. The pages blurred and his hands shook. Catherine left twice, swallowed by memory, only to return and continue. Together they built a case that was a slow, terrible thing, page after page of evidence piling in an act as deliberate as the atrocities it recorded. They were so absorbed that they missed the first sounds: footfalls on the upper stairs, a lantern's flare in the outer chamber, the heavier light of more than one torch. Ezekiel looked up before the outer room's single lamp could be explained. The breath left him cold. Silas Rutledge stood framed in the doorway, calm as a man who had been expecting a betrayal he engineered himself. 2 men flanked him. Behind them, other shapes filled the main cellar like shadows come to stand. "I must admit," Silas said, voice smooth as a polished floor, "I am impressed. I did not expect you to find the inner chamber." Catherine rose slowly and placed herself between her father and Ezekiel, a small figure gathering force. "You were supposed to be in Charleston," she said. "I was supposed to be," Silas agreed, and his smile was the kind that cut. "But I never trusted your miraculous recovery. So I returned today and watched the house all evening. I wanted to see what you might do." He stepped into the cellar, the men closing behind him like bookends. "Did you truly think I would not anticipate this? That I would not prepare for the possibility you might begin to remember and seek revenge?" Catherine's voice, when it came, was steady in a way that made the room lean in. "You have been poisoning me for 16 years. You saw something you should not have as a child. You could not allow that knowledge to spread." Silas' advanced eyes cold and almost amused. "You were a child. You could not understand. You could not be trusted. I acted for necessity." He folded the word around him like armor. "You saw a murder and you named it evil. I call it preservation." Ezekiel said nothing. His mind worked in the quiet, counting men, judging distances, weighing chances. 7 men stood around them, armed by position and numbers. 2 people, one of whom was scarcely hale enough to carry her own body. The tableau looked hopeless. Silas's tone softened with the indulgence of a man deciding the fate of an ant. "Do not do anything foolish," he said. "I prefer not to kill either of you tonight. Not permanently, but this rebellion cannot be allowed to continue." He gestured to the men behind him. "Bring them upstairs. We will discuss what happens next." Hands gripped wrists, feet scraped on cellar earth. Ezekiel and Catherine were escorted not into the open, but into the house, their path lit by torches, and the faces of men who knew how to keep secrets. They were taken to Silas's study and closed inside together. Door-latched windows shuttered the house above, settling into an uneasy hush, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting to see which way the night would break. The study was windowless, save for a single transom, set high and high the room could not reach. The door was heavy oak, bolted from the outside, so that the world beyond felt very far away. When the 2 were left alone, Catherine moved to Ezekiel with the urgency of someone who has learned nights are dangerous. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No, miss," he replied. "But we are in serious trouble." "Yes, but not as much as you think." Catherine reached inside her dress and drew out the papers they had risked their lives to copy. "I kept these," she whispered. "He did not search me." Too confident, Ezekiel let the breath out. He didn't know he'd been holding. "That will not save us if they decide to kill us both. We will not die, not tonight," she said. Her eyes were small, bright, calculating. "My father will prefer to resolve this without killing me if he can. I am his blood. That gives us leverage." They listened then as men came, and rooms filled the hush of boots on boards, voices like low weather. The brethren were assembling. The door opened at last. and Marcus Fanning stood framed in the doorway, face set as if duty and dread had carved him thin. "They are ready for you," he said. "Come peacefully, and you will not be harmed." They were led down again. The main chamber had been changed for the occasion. 13 bodies in ritual robes. Candles thick in every holder so the cellar trembled with light. The altar draped in crimson cloth as if to dress a wound. 13 chairs formed a perfect ring, all of them filled save the one at the head where Silas would sit. Ezekiel and Catherine were forced to the center, made to stand opposite the man who had shaped their fates. Faces watched them in the circle, some mild, some thin, with contempt. Silas removed his hood and spoke with the smooth authority of a man who believed himself above reproach. "Brothers of the harvest," he intoned, "thank you for coming on short notice. We face a crisis. My daughter and her companion discovered our inner chamber. They saw the ledger. They were copying entries when I interrupted them." A chorus of low responses rippled. Judge Pelam's voice cut in thin and quick. "Then, they must be silenced permanently. This is not difficult." Silas lifted a hand to quiet him. "I disagree." His tone held a strange weight. "My daughter is blood. I cannot simply dispose of her without first exhausting other options. And this man," he turned to Ezekiel, "represents an opportunity." "Opportunity for what?" Reverend Crenshaw asked, suspicion curling his words. "To test a belief I have long held," Silas said, eyes level. "That a person can be drawn into our work if given the right frame. Ezekiel, you want revenge for what I did to your family. I understand that." His voice was almost gentle in the way it measured men. "But what if I offer you another kind of revenge? Not simply death, for death, something more useful." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "I do not understand." Silas smiled the kind of smile that makes small men look away. "Membership," he said. "Not equal membership. This society does not admit men of color as brothers, but affiliation. An associate. Attend our gatherings, perform roles we assign, and in return, I will grant you what you most desire." He named a plantation owner in Alabama, Edward Gaines, someone beyond the Brethren's protection. "He is not one of us. If you help us, I will give you the resources money information means to make him suffer as your family suffered." The offer hung in the air like a lie dressed as mercy. Join the men who destroyed his family to get vengeance on another man. And if Ezekiel refused, Silas made the alternative. Plain death for both of them, their bodies fed to the swamps, the papers burned, the journals erased. Life on one condition, oblivion on the other. Ezekiel glanced at Catherine. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She gave the faintest shake of her head. "Do not become them." But Ezekiel's mind was already calculating the possibilities of going inside, of learning names and places, of buying time to gather more proof. He could imagine being a spy within the very belly of what had eaten his family. "What happens to her?" he asked, voice careful. "If I join, what becomes of Catherine?" "She will go back to her room," Silas said, "resume her medications. Forget. Or she dies with you." "No," Catherine snapped. "I will not forget again. I will not be silenced. Kill me if you must, Father, but I will not pretend I do not know what you are." Silas's face narrowed. He considered the room, men who would rather not have blood on their hands if avoidance served them. And then, after a long moment, he spoke. "Wait," Ezekiel said quickly, stepping forward. I accept on one condition: Catherine goes free, not return to her old routines, not back to this house. Let her leave South Carolina. Give her passage a new name, money to live. She must never return or contact this place. She will be dead to everyone here. Murmurs rippled through the circle. Some hands shook their heads. The idea of a daughter walking away unsettled those who believed blood was a thing to be owned. Judge Pelham cleared his throat with the practiced sound of a man who sizes a threat by what it might cost him. "The boy makes a point," he said, finally. "The girl is broken. Even if she spoke, who would believe her? A man willing to join us, complicit in our rights, is invaluable. It shows our reach." Silas weighed the calculation as if balancing coins. At last, he inclined his head. "Very well, she will be sent north. I have associates in Philadelphia who will take her in. A new identity, a small stipend to live. But she will never return to South Carolina. She will be dead to this place." Catherine stared at Ezekiel. Her hand found his for a moment, a small, fierce clasp. "No," she breathed. "I will not leave you two." "Agreed." Ezekiel interrupted resolve, steadier than it had been in him for a long time. "She goes free. I join you." A strange pact sealed in that windowless room, one of the few bargains where promises were both mercy and betrayal. Above them, the house settled ignorant as the brethren rearranged themselves, and the night outside kept its own counsel. Silas's voice carried the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Catherine leaves tomorrow. Ezekiel's initiation will be held in 3 weeks at the next gathering. Until then, he remains at Cypress Grove under watch. Should he attempt escape or contact anyone, the bargain is void. Both die." "Understood." Ezekiel gave a slow nod. Catherine's lips parted as if to protest, but Ezekiel met her gaze and shook his head ever so slightly. "Trust me." At dawn, a carriage waited outside the manor, its lamps glowing dimly in the mist. Catherine was escorted inside without a word. From his cabin window, Ezekiel watched as the wheels crunched over the gravel, fording down the long drive until both carriage and sound were swallowed by the trees. He hadn't been allowed to speak to her since that night in the cellar. But before being led away, she had turned once, just once, and in that fleeting glance, he saw the truth she understood. She knew this was not surrender but strategy. Still, he couldn't help but wonder, would she truly go north to Philadelphia as promised? Or did she have her own plans, hidden even from him? The next 3 weeks crawled by in a haze of heat and vigilance. 2 overseers shadowed Ezekiel everywhere. He was forbidden from leaving the plantation grounds. His days were filled with meaningless labor-fixing fences that didn't need repair, moving crates that led nowhere. Work meant only to dull the mind, not the will. But beneath that surface of submission, Ezekiel was learning, watching, counting every guard, every locked door, every window that faced the swamps. He memorized the rhythms of the house, the hours when the overseers drank the times, when Silas's study stood unguarded, and the names of the enslaved who could be trusted with silence. He said, little caused no trouble, pretended to have accepted defeat. And yet, each night as the plantation sank into darkness, he sat awake in his cabin, whispering to the ghosts of his wife and children. The time was coming, he told them. He would see justice done, but even he wasn't sure what justice meant anymore. He knew the brethren would demand something terrible for his initiation, something that would bind him to them forever. How far was he willing to go to stop them? How much of his own soul was he ready to offer? He didn't have an answer. Then, on the night of June 2nd, long after the plantation had gone, still came the sound of knocking. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Ezekiel rose and opened the door. There stood Silas, cloaked in shadow alone. "May I come in?" Ezekiel stepped aside. Silas entered, eyes roaming the small cabin as if measuring the shape of Ezekiel's world. Then he sat uninvited in the single wooden chair. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "you will become one of us. Not fully. Of course you never will. But enough." "I understand what I agreed to," Ezekiel replied. "Do you?" Silas tilted his head. "Do you truly?" He leaned back, the lamplight catching the lines of his face. "The brethren has existed for 43 years. In all that time, no one has ever broken our silence." "Do you know why?" Fear, Ezekiel said, partly. Silas smiled faintly. "But also loyalty. We take care of our own. A man joins us and suddenly doors open. Business prospers. Enemies falter. The law becomes flexible. We are not just a society, we are the current beneath the South. Once you are within that current, even as an associate, it will carry you to places you never imagined." Ezekiel's voice was steady. "And in exchange, I help you murder people." Silas did not flinch. "In exchange, you help maintain the natural order. The strong over the weak. The powerful over the powerless. That is how the world survives." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "You killed my family to prove that order." "I did," Silas said, calm as stone. "And I would again." Sentiment is weakness. Love is weakness. The moment you care more for people than for power, you've already lost. He leaned forward now, his voice low, almost persuasive. "But listen, Ezekiel. Your family is gone. Nothing you do can bring them back. But you can make their deaths mean something. You can work from within to temper us, to guide how power is used, to make change slowly, safely. You could prevent other families from suffering the same fate." For a moment, the words almost sounded true. Almost. And yet, in the silence that followed, Ezekiel realized Silas wasn't offering salvation. He was offering corruption wrapped in reason. Power disguised as mercy. And that was the most dangerous lie of all. Silas's offer had worn the shape of a trap the moment Ezekiel heard it. The idea that he could use their power to do good from within was a tidy rationalization, one offered by men who wrapped poison in honey and called it medicine. The moment he joined their rites, he would be stained. The moment he accepted their protection, he would be bought. "Why, tell me?" This Ezekiel asked the question, more a test than a demand. "Because I want you to succeed," Silas replied, voice smooth as oil. "An ally is more useful than an enemy. Because I killed your family, and yet I do not wish to kill you." He stood then, moving toward the single chair as if to make the room small with the weight of his conviction. "Tomorrow night, you will be asked to do something difficult. Whatever you're asked, do it. Do not hesitate. Do not show weakness. Fail, and both you and Catherine die. I know she's not really in Philadelphia. She hides. She plots. If she surfaces, and you have not proven your loyalty, she will be found and killed. Do you understand? Ice slid down Ezekiel's spine. Catherine lived, and the life she would have depended on his actions. I understand, he said. Silas left without another word, the oak door closing like a verdict. Ezekiel sat in the dark of his cabin and thought of the impossible choice before him: become complicit in horror or find some other way. A third path hummed at the edges of his mind, the one neither Silas nor his brethren imagined. He reached for the paper with his family's names, the ink black in moonlight, and pressed his forehead to it. Forgive me, he whispered, for what I am about to do, for what I must become. I promise it will not be for nothing. That night, June 3rd, at the stroke of midnight, the initiation began. 2 brethren members brought Ezekiel down to the cellar. They stripped him to the waist and bound his hands behind him so that the small of his back was exposed and vulnerable. He was forced down the worn steps into the lantern-lit chamber where 13 men in their robes waited like a circle of judges. Silas stood at the head of the altar, voice steady and ceremonial. Brothers of the harvest, tonight we perform an initiation unlike any in our history. We bring into our circle a man who has every reason to hate us, a man who has lost everything because of what we are. We do this to prove that our power extends even to our enemies. 2 brethren stepped forward, then bearing a struggling bound figure. They placed her on the altar. She was young, perhaps 18 or 19, her eyes wide with terror. A gag muffled her pleas. She looked at Ezekiel, and his chest clenched with the sight of her helplessness. This is your test, Ezekiel, Silas said. You must take the knife and make the first cut. Prove that your desire for revenge is stronger than your moral objections. Refuse and you die. Accept and you become one of us, and we will help you destroy the man who murdered your family. A low chant began, a sound that seemed to crawl along the stone and into Ezekiel's bones. Words he did not know, but that tightened the air. Silas held out a long wicked blade, the leather of its hilt worn by hands practiced in use. Take it, he intoned. Ezekiel looked at the woman on the table. She met his eyes, pleading, and in that instant he saw every face that had suffered in silence his Sarah Benjamin Ruth. He saw himself reflected in the small, scared face of the girl. He saw the ledger, the names, the ledger that had been the map of his grief. The room held its breath. 13 men watched to see whether he would become them or die refusing. He stepped forward, accepting the blade. The brethren members murmured approving. Silas smiled a thin, satisfied curve. The chant swelled. The candles flared and shadows thrown large on the walls. Ezekiel raised the knife and in the stillness moved, but not toward the woman. He turned instead on the nearest robe-clad man. The blade flashed and sank into a throat. Blood arced bright and horrible in lamplight. A throat closed. The man fell, crashing against the stone. Ezekiel did not pause. He grabbed the fallen man's robe and, in a single motion, wrenched it over the nearest candles, sending flame licking up into cloth. Darkness swallowed half the chamber as fire ate light. Chaos poured through the ranks like spilled wine. Men shrieked, stumbled. Some tried to seize him, others to stamp out the spreading fire. Ezekiel moved like a force honed on pain. Years of rage condensed into a single terrible urgency. He used one man as a shield, threw bodies against others, kicked and struck until bone met bone and teeth clicked on jaw. He reached the altar, slashed bonds with the knife he had kept, and pulled the young woman free. "Run!" he shouted, voice breaking through smoke and shouts. She scrambled down gag, falling from her mouth, and fled into the darkness that led upward. Ezekiel turned, facing what was left. 7 men still standing, arms ready. Faces suddenly animal with the smell of fear. Silas's voice cut through the din cold and leveled as if he had been conducting a symphony. "You have killed yourself and Catherine." "Both," he said, almost bored. Maybe Ezekiel answered breath thick, "But I will take as many of you with me as I can." And then above from the house, a new sound, a clatter of feet, a rustle rising into a chorus. Catherine had not gone to Philadelphia. She had never left. She had hidden instead in the quarters where the enslaved slept, moving among them, speaking softly, stitching together an alliance that had been years in the making. When she heard the commotion from below the woman's scream, the clatter of a falling candle, she knew the moment had come. She ran toward the stairs, voice like a bell. Outside the cellar, the night opened like a wound, and the plantation's other hearts began to beat in time with the violence below. They called it the reckoning. Catherine had spent 3 weeks moving through the night, a quiet shadow, slipping between cabins and under fences, speaking in low, urgent voices to people who had watched her grow and had themselves been ground down by the same hands that raised her. She went from plantation to plantation, names, faces, histories, remembered telling them about the brethren and the ledger and the cellar. She told them tonight could end it. 23 people answered that call. Men and women who had nothing left to lose, who had watched children pulled into ritual and never returned, who had felt the slow erosion of dignity across decades, came armed with what they could steal from fields and sheds, axes, scythes, hammers, the blunt tools of a life that had given them practice at endurance. They carried with them a rage grown like a second skin, patient and inevitable. When the young woman fled from the altar screaming, Catherine led the swarm down. The brethren, still reeling from Ezekiel's assault, heard them too late. The enslaved people poured into the cellar like a tide breaking a weak dam. What followed was swift and without mercy. This was not mindless slaughter. It was the righteous, brutal undoing of those who had been taught their lives meant nothing. Judge Pelham aimed a pistol and fell before he could fire. Reverend Crenshaw begged. Marcus Fanning tried to run and was yanked back by hands that no longer accepted orders from privilege. Silas, watching the collapse of everything he'd thought secure, made a last, desperate gambit. He seized Catherine and pressed a knife to her throat. "Stop," he croaked. "Stop, or I kill her." The room stilled. Catherine faced him without tremor. "Do it," she said, cold as an icicle. "Kill me. It changes nothing. You already lost." He lunged, but she drove an elbow into his ribs, a quick, brutal move that loosened his grip. She twisted away, and before he could recover, Ezekiel was upon him. They confronted one another in that narrow, terrible place, the man who had cultivated cruelty as a craft, and the man whose family had been carved from his life for the sake of a demonstration. "You took everything from me," Ezekiel said quietly. "My wife, my children, my life. You did it because it pleased you to prove something to men who thought cruelty was virtue. Please, Silas managed one small pathetic plea. Did my wife plead? Ezekiel asked. Did my son? Did the woman you cut on that altar? His voice was steady. No mercy. Not for you? Not ever. What came next was brutal and final. The enslaved people moved with the efficiency of those who have learned violence, not as sport, but as survival. 13 men who had believed themselves shielded by name and coin discovered in their last breaths the lie at the heart of their power that cruelty makes you immortal. It does not. It makes you vulnerable to the very things you deny. When the blood finished its business and the cellar fell into a silence that was not peace but exhaustion, Catherine stood at the center of the ruin, shaking not with fear but with a release that was nearly human in its intensity. 16 years of built-up rage and suffocation had found an outlet. Ezekiel came to her, breathing hard hands, trembling. Are you hurt? He asked. No, she said. And you? Minor cuts, she answered. Nothing serious. They looked around at the bodies, at the overturned chairs, at robes smoked and stained. Ezekiel's practical mind cut in. What do we do now? Catherine's smile was a flat, bitter thing. Now we burn it all. He blinked. But the ledger, the journals, they prove what they did. They can bring justice. Justice. She spat softly a laugh with no humor. What do you think happens if we walk into a courthouse with that book? We will be hunted. Surviving chapters of the Brethren will come for us. This ends only one way: if everyone believes the Cypress Grove chapter died by accident, if the ledger is gone, if no witness stands to tell the story. Ezekiel felt the truth settle harsh cold. The ledger's paper could free them or doom them. In the world they inhabited, proof could mean a target on their backs rather than a parade of indictments. Catherine was right. The only survival that made sense in that moment was erasure. They prepared with grim, efficient calm. For 2 hours they moved like people accustomed to concealment oil, poured through cracks and seams, wood stacked in patterns that would feed a fast, intense inferno. The friends who had come to strike left before dawn, melting back into the plantations they called home with an understanding that would not be spoken aloud. What they had seen that night would be kept as if it had never happened. That is how many survived this work. They understood the cost. Catherine and Ezekiel placed the bodies with a cruel logic designed to suggest accident positions and placements that could be explained away if anyone wished to do the explaining. Then they piled the ledger and the journals, the neat stacks of proof that could burn the men and families they had lost, in the center of the altar. Wait, Ezekiel said at the last moment. He opened the ledger again, fingers moving with a tenderness that made the room sharper. He found the entries about his wife, his son, his daughter, October 1838. He tore those pages free, folding them carefully and pressing them to his chest beneath his shirt. For them, he whispered, so they are not lost entirely. Catherine nodded once. Then, without ceremony, she raised a candle to the oil-soaked wood. The flame licked took, and the cellar answered with a roar, smoke and heat swallowing paper and ink, devouring names that had been used as a chain. The ledger became light. The voices on its pages were silenced by flame. They watched until the paper was ash, until the last curl of smoke was carried upward. Outside, Dawn crept silver and indifferent over Cypress Grove, as if the world had turned and nothing terrible had happened at all. Inside the house, two figures remained among the echoes of what they had undone, knowing what they had done and also what it had cost.